The silence of the pine forest was shattered not by a gunshot, but by the frantic, static, cracked voice of a young soldier screaming into his radio. "They're killing everyone! They're killing everyone!" Those 6 words, a desperate transmission from a remote outpost in the Kunar province of Afghanistan, were the first and last warning of the nightmare that would come to be known as the Outpost 17 Massacre, a tragedy that would ultimately reveal a monster not in the enemy's ranks, but within our own. At the center of it all was Sergeant Elias Vance, a man who, on the surface, was the very image of an American war hero. With a square jaw, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a chest full of medals from 2 previous tours, he was the leader every green soldier hoped for, charismatic, hardened, and fiercely protective of his men. His second-in-command, Corporal Leo Jin, was his opposite. Quiet, methodical, with a photographer's eye for detail and a deep, unsettling sense of foreboding he kept locked away in his journal. The unit was a mix of youthful exuberance and weary experience, all looking to Sergeant Vance for guidance in a valley the soldiers grimly nicknamed the Reaper, S. Bowl, for its deadly history of ambushes. The official report was a clean, brutal story of war. Outpost 17, a small, undermanned position, was overrun in a coordinated Taliban dawn attack. The enemy, using superior numbers and rocket-propelled grenades, breached the wire. In the ensuing chaos, all 12 American soldiers were killed. The sole survivor was Sergeant Elias Vance, who was found by a quick reaction force wandering in the smoke, his uniform caked in the blood of his comrades, a vacant stare in his eyes, and a story of heroic, last stands, and impossible odds. He was hailed as a miracle, the lone wolf who had cheated death. He received a Silver Star and was sent home a hero, his face splashed across newspapers, a symbol of resilience in a brutal war. But back in the quiet suburbs of Ohio, Leo Jin's father, a meticulous and heartbroken man named David, received his son's personal effects. Among the dog tags and folded flag was Leo's journal, and in its pages, David Jin found a truth so terrifying he could scarcely believe it. The entries spoke not of a revered leader, but of a man unraveling. Leo wrote of Vance's increasing paranoia, his rage at command for denying his requests for more men, and a series of dark, unsettling quotes. One, circled and dated 3 days before the attack, read, "Vance said, 'Sometimes you have to create a storm to prove you're the only one who can sail in it.'" David Jin, armed with nothing but a father's grief and a pocketful of suspicion, took the journal to the Army's Criminal Investigation Command. At first, they were dismissive. Battle stress, they said, the ramblings of a scared kid. But one agent, a weary and dogged investigator named Marcus Thorne, couldn't let it go. Thorne was a man who believed in evidence, not heroes, and the journal entries created a crack in the official narrative that he felt compelled to pry open. His investigation began in the shadows, re-interviewing the soldiers from the Quick Reaction Force, the medics who had treated Vance, and the intelligence analysts who had studied the aftermath. The initial forensics from the outpost, conducted in the immediate fog of war, had supported the ambush theory. But Thorne looked deeper. The bullet trajectories, the placement of the bodies, the types of wounds, something was off. The kill shots were too precise, too clinical, not the chaotic spray of fire from a rushing enemy force. Then came the first major break, a ballistics report that had been misfiled. One of the rounds recovered from a soldier's body was not from an AK-47, the Taliban's weapon of choice. It was a 5.25 round, fired from an M4 carbine, standard issue for the U.S. Army. The case was blown wide open. The investigation shifted from a tragic loss in combat to a potential mass murder. Sergeant Elias Vance was no longer a witness, he was the prime suspect. Thorne and his team returned to Afghanistan, conducting a new, painstaking excavation of the outpost. The site had been picked over by insurgents and the elements, but they found one piece of evidence that had been overlooked, a single, spent 5.56 mm cartridge, lodged in the dirt beneath a collapsed supply crate. Its firing pin impression was a perfect match to Vance's rifle. The prosecution built a chilling case. They alleged that Vance, enraged by what he saw as abandonment from his command and seeking to create a legendary event to cement his own status as a warrior, had orchestrated the massacre. He had first killed his most loyal soldier, Corporal Jin, likely because Jin had sensed his plan. Then, as the other soldiers, disoriented and trusting, responded to what they thought was an enemy attack, Vance had moved through the outpost, methodically turning his weapon on them in the chaos he himself had created. The final piece of the prosecution's puzzle was the radio transmission. A voice analysis expert testified that the panicked voice screaming, "They're killing everyone," was not, as initially assumed, a young private, but Corporal Leo Jin. He hadn't been screaming about the Taliban. He had been screaming about Vance. The court-martial was a media firestorm, a brutal dissection of American heroism. The defense painted Vance as a victim of post-traumatic stress, a soldier pushed beyond human limits who had snapped in the face of a real enemy assault. They argued the ballistics evidence was circumstantial, that Vance's rifle was not the only M4 at the outpost. For days, it was a battle of experts, a complex and grueling affair that left the jury of military officers looking strained. Vance himself took the stand, his hero's facade replaced by a cold, detached arrogance. He stuck to his story, his voice flat as he described the faceless enemy swarming the compound. He showed no emotion, even when describing finding the bodies of his men. It was under the prosecution's cross-examination that the climax arrived. The prosecutor, a calm but relentless woman named Colonel Shaw, didn't shout or accuse. She simply presented him with Leo Jin's journal, open to the page with the damning quote. "Sergeant Vance," she asked, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom, "what storm did you create at Outpost 17? Vance's eyes flickered. For a single, unguarded moment, the cold mask slipped, and a glimpse of profound, arrogant pride shone through. He didn't answer. He just stared, a predator caught in the light. But it was the prosecutor's next move that sealed his fate. She played the radio transmission again, the one of Jin screaming. But this time, she had an enhanced audio track. In the background, beneath the static and the panic, the audio forensic team had isolated another sound, a sound that had been there all along, the distinct rhythmic cough of a single M4 carbine, firing in controlled, deadly bursts. And then, just before the transmission cut out, a voice, low and calm, uttering two words. It was Vance's voice. He said, "My masterpiece." The gasp in the courtroom was collective. The jury looked at him, not as a hero or a broken soldier, but as something else entirely. The clinical precision of the words, the sheer vanity they revealed, was more damning than any confession. He hadn't snapped. He had composed. The verdict was guilty on 12 counts of premeditated murder. Elias Vance was stripped of his rank, his medals, and his freedom, sentenced to spend the rest of his life in the military prison at Fort Leavenworth. He had sought to create a legend on that bloody battlefield, but the only legacy he built was one of unspeakable betrayal. The soldiers of Outpost 17 did not fall to a foreign enemy in a fair fight. They were executed by the man they were trained to trust with their lives. He didn't just break the rules of war, he rewrote them in the blood of his own men. If stories like this keep you hooked, hit subscribe for more.